Hello students, and welcome back to the EPQ course. In this video I'm going to be looking at academic language and how to write your report with precision and authority. But before I begin that, I'm calling this a health check just to make sure that you're up to date, that your project management skills are good. You should now have completed your planning review of your project queue. It should be done in detail with lots of examples and evidence of decision making and problem solving. You should have had a meeting with your supervisor in order to discuss your introduction. You should now have 1,000 words complete of your report. This is absolutely essential, and this is something that I will be checking on. You should have your supervisor or your teacher check this. Remember, you can't expect extensive feedback. It's not the nature of the EPQ and it's against exam rules. But you can get some general sense of whether you're on point and whether your report has a clear sense of direction. And if you're doing an artifact, you should now really have completed a prototype, because in the next 2 weeks, we'll be moving on to the mid-project review. And once that's closed, you cannot change the task. Now, if you're doing a research question-based report, you should now in your introduction have a brief context. We've gone through this. The most important section is establishing the debate or the argument. Remember, the argument should drive the report forward, and there should be a very clear sense of purpose. In the first section, most of you have probably included an extended section of context or background. This should have many references. Don't forget to decide whether you're going to be using the Harvard system, the author date system, or whether you're going to be using footnotes. So that's something that both I and your supervisors will be checking for. Or if you don't feel the need for an extended context, you could get into your first argument. It's very important that you're using very clear subheadings, but also that you're joining the sections of your report together so that it flows and it's coherent. Similarly, if you're doing an artifact, I think it's very important that you have some brief context in the introduction, but the most important thing is a sense of purpose. What is it that the artifact is going to do? And also in the introduction, I think you should signpost the structure of the report. In the first section, once again, I think you should be giving clear ideas of your research base, your context, and the background to your particular artifact. Now, to get to the actual meat of this video, we're going to be looking at academic language. I'm going to be looking at introductory phrases, moving on to looking at phrases for defining and clarifying. Number 3 will be limiting the scope of the report. This is very important. I think you'll find this interesting. 4, we'll be exploring the idea of disagreements. This is using the proponents-opponents structure, or critics and advocates, or whichever terms you want to use. I like these terms because they drive the debate forward and they place the debate and evaluation at the center of the EPQ report. We're going to look at analytical phrases, phrases that encourage analysis, and we're also going to be looking at what I call dismantling phrases. That's when you're taking an argument apart. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the absolute vital importance of mini conclusions, or what we could call interim conclusions, as you finish a particular section. Don't forget, there isn't just one conclusion in a 5,000 word report. There should be a number of them. Now, beginning with the idea of the introduction, which I've called establishing the debate, I'm going to be looking at a number of phrases which I think are really important. You don't have to use them, but they give you an idea of the kind of lexical structures, linguistic structures that will appear in your introduction. Beginning with this one. This has led to a hotly contested debate between, and this is where you are identifying the debate. Alternatively, you could say something like this: while conservatives often tend to X, progressive commentators sharply disagree. Okay, now I find that an interesting one, because then you're putting two ideologies or political groups against each other. Again, the idea of establishing a debate. Moving on, recent commentators have disputed this position. Here you are drawing attention to the redrafting of the problem and showing why there's a debate. Remember, in your introduction, you begin the debate, and your report must be an argument, not a description or an explanation. Here's another way that you can do it. Revisionist accounts of X, revisionist account of X has pointed to significant gaps in the account of Y. So revisionist means that you come along and you have changed the findings. So once again, there is a big debate here. Another very useful phrase is to say more recent research using the X method has resulted in significantly different findings. This is really interesting, particularly if you're doing something like psychology or social science, where people attempt to replicate the findings of an original study and they find something very different. Now, putting that in your introduction shows that there is a debate between the more traditional view and the revisionist view. Now, in terms of signposting the purpose, these phrases are very useful. Now, signposting is where you are showing the reader exactly what you're setting out to do in this report. It's like a kind of a compass or a roadmap that helps people navigate their way through a longer piece of writing. Phrases such as these are useful. This report will therefore investigate whether. The purpose of this report is to establish that, and you continue it. A subsidiary, secondary purpose of this report will be, and I've included that one just to remind you that you might have a primary purpose, a main one, and then you might have broken it down into 2, 3, or 4 subsidiary purposes, and you can also put those into the introduction, or you can bring them into the main body of the report later on. But you are showing a very clear sense of purpose, what you are setting out to do in this particular study. Here's another very useful phrase. Although a complete study of X is beyond the scope of this report, I will be examining whether, now this is really important because sometimes you narrow the focus of the report to say I can't do everything, and that's why I'm going to sharply focus on the following. And a very sharp focus is a sign of an A-star EPQ report. Now, there's some phrases or sentences which are very good at defining and clarifying. Really good EPQ reports have very clear definitions, particularly of tricky words. Here's a notorious one, justice. So I've said here, since the term justice is contentious, people argue about it, it is necessary to provide a clear definition that will henceforth be employed in this report. Very important that you get your definitions right. How are you going to define the key terms in your task? Although there's much debate about the meaning of X, so this would be any particular word in which there is debate, for the purpose of this report it will be defined as. Now it's very important because you're going to keep coming back to that particular purpose. And thirdly, this report will decide whether X is effective by employing 3 specific criteria, A, B, and C. Now, this is really important because if you've got a kind of research question which you're going to say, is this effective? In other words, you have to evaluate something. You would say the 3 criteria that I am going to use to evaluate this are the following. And then your reader knows exactly what the criteria you are using in order to come to a judgment. And the judgment will be in the conclusion. Now, limiting the scope of the report may be something that you've not come into contact with before. In my own research writing, I find this very useful. You can't cover everything in 5,000 words. And one of the things that you can do is push things out of the report that you don't want to discuss. So you could use phrases like this. This report will focus exclusively on X and will not be addressing Y. And you could say because and give some reason if you particularly wanted to. Another phrase that might be very useful is, although there are other factors at play, this report will concentrate on. And this is quite often why in my titles I often will use X versus Y, because there might be lots and lots of criteria, and a good EPQ report doesn't talk about 8 or 10 things. It talks about 2 or 3 things, because then you can get depth and you can go into real analysis. Another phrase you could use is a complete study of all the factors is beyond the scope of this report, and therefore. And I also think it's very important to say that footnotes can be very useful at limiting the scope of the report. And I'll show you how to do that. So say, for instance, you'd say, for a full account of epigenetics, see Flynn P., a study into epigenetics. Now, you could put that into your footnote, and then what you're showing the reader is you don't have time to go into that level of difficulty, but you give them a kind of place to go if they wanted to check your facts or if they wanted to go into greater detail than you're able to. Now, moving on, exploring disagreements. One of the best things to do in highly successful EPQ reports, and this is a technique that stops your report becoming an explanation or a description, is to use this idea of foes or rivals. Or proponents and opponents. And these kind of phrases keep you arguing. Many opponents of the genetic view contend that blah, 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 blah. A significant critique of this position has come from a study by X. So you're using the idea of a critique there as opposed to opponents, but the principle remains the same. It's position X versus position Y. In contrast, opponents point to some of the limitations of this research. And then this would be where you come in with a counter argument, showing why the opponents did not like the argument that was above. Proponents dismiss this claim, pointing out that, and again. So it allows you to move between the two different positions, say what the two different positions are, analyze them, and finally evaluate them. And I'll talk a little bit more about evaluation in a moment. Finally, proponents argue that whilst X does have a point, the evidence is overwhelming that. So in that case, they're nuancing it. They're admitting that there's a grain of truth in a position, but they are saying that theirs is the stronger argument. Now, analytical phrases are really important. Just to remind you, analysis is when you break things down into their constituent parts. What are the parts that make the argument up? How do they fit together? Now, these phrases are very good because they make sure that you're analyzing studies rather than just telling us what happened or describing them. The significance of this is, and go and tell us what the significance is. This is the so what. I'm telling you this, and this is why you need to know it. Why this study is so groundbreaking is that, again, and now you're going to tell us why it's so groundbreaking, what it's done, how has it changed the debate or added to the debate or brought in new interesting evidence. X's critique is of considerable importance, beg your pardon there, since it establishes that, and you tell us why it's so important by showing us now how it's going to change the terrain, the research, the argument, etc. And finally, this study avoids many of the shortcomings of previous research. Shortcomings is a very good phrase to use because it shows that you are now looking for errors in them. Now, continuing on the same theme, I've called this dismantling. These kind of phrases allow you to pick a study apart. And this is part of the analysis and evaluation element of it, where you're showing your AO3 problem-solving skills. These results can, however, be questioned for the following reason. Interestingly, later clinical studies do not reproduce these results. So here you're going to take them apart and you're going to say, this is where you'd introduce rival studies and say, look, I'm taking this apart. I'm showing that when they went to replicate it, they had different findings. A meta-analysis of X has shown more varied results. Now, it's always useful if you can get a meta-analysis because that is a combination of multiple different studies into the same area, and it has a reputation of producing greater reliability because it combines all of these studies and produces more generalized trends and data. A more meticulous analysis of the study reveals significant flaws. And now you're going to tell me what the flaws are in that study. Was there bias from the research? Did the money come from an oil company? Did the person who conducted the study not actually have many qualifications? Was the sample size too small, etc., etc.? And finally, a number of generalizations based off a relatively small sample reveals that, again, generalizations is good, because what you're showing is they've, conducted a study, they've looked at 3 people, and they've come out with trends for countries. So looking at things like sample sizes, etc., and showing in your language that you are aware of these shortcomings or these irregularities in the study is what is so important. Now, finally, mini conclusions, and these are absolutely key. I mentioned them earlier. Therefore, in terms of X, the proponent's argument is clearly more compelling as you finish a section of the report, you conclude and you declare which of the 2 is the winner. Just to remind you, if you are using this language of opponents and proponents over here that I talked about here, you can say position X, position Y. Well, in the mini conclusions, as you come to an end of the section of the report, you declare the stronger argument. And you say, to conclude this section, X has presented a more sound argument based on extensive research and meta-analysis. Or, on balance, X appears to be the stronger argument in this regard as, and you would go on to say, etc. Now, I just want to end by reminding you, though, it's very important that even though you're using these sections and then you're going to have mini conclusions which show the reader why that section was significant in terms of answering a research question, can I remind you also to make sure that you connect the different sections of the report, that you have transition phrases where you say, next the report will investigate the following, etc., so that you bind it and you make sure that it is coherent. Now, very briefly, just with the following 2 slides, I just want to remind you how important it is to use connectives. And connectives aren't all the same. As you can see from the slide here, there's addition, sequence, consequence, contrast, certainly, reason, condition, summary, and in the following slide, again, a whole variety of these, and you can pause that slide and look at them. This is the way that we glue our report together, that we move from topic to topic and make it smooth and coherent. It is absolutely key to use connectives in your writing, to bind the logic of your report, and to provide the flow so that your reader can follow you. I always say to my students, it's a bit like grasping the reader by the hand and pulling them along on a journey, explaining where we're going as we move on. Finally, then, to conclude, it's very important, the introduction, that you establish the debate and define the purpose. Do not forget to constantly define and clarify terms, especially key terms that are in your research question. Limit the scope of the report if you don't want to discuss something. Vital, probably the most important thing, is to have a debate at the core of the report, and I've strongly recommended that you've used this language of proponents and opponents, okay? Use analytical phrases and dismantling phrases to show analytical flaws and things that you would like to criticize in the report or to praise. And finally, mini or interim conclusions tell your reader what the significance of that section of the report is. They are absolutely crucial in terms of building up and evaluating arguments. Thank you so much for listening. I do hope that helps you with the writing of your EPQ report.